do, Mr. President, and I would ask unanimous consent to do this, is to introduce a list of a number of corporations who are making huge profits and who are paying virtually nothing in taxes and in some cases getting a rebate.
Without objection.
Mr. President, let me just briefly read this list of corporate freeloaders. Number one, ExxonMobil, largest oil company in the world. In 2009, ExxonMobil made $19 billion in profits, and not only did ExxonMobil avoid paying any federal income taxes that year, they actually received a $156 million rebate from the IRS, according to its SEC filings. Well, do you think maybe we might want to ask ExxonMobil to pay a little in taxes so we don't have to throw children off of their health insurance? Maybe. Bank of America. Last year, Bank of America, largest bank in America, received a $1.9 billion tax refund from the IRS, even though it made $4.4 billion in profits, and just a couple of years ago received a bailout from the Federal Reserve and the Treasury Department of nearly $1 trillion. Well, what do you know about that? We're bailing out largest banks in this country whose greed caused the recession, and then they get a rebate from the IRS rather than paying any taxes. And yet our Republican friends think the solution to deficit reduction is not to ask Bank of America to pay their fair share, but to end Medicare as we know it and force low-income seniors to pay substantially more for their health care. Number three, General Electric. Over the past 5 years, while General Electric made $26 billion in profits in the U.S., it received a $4.1 billion refund from the IRS. I don't know. What do you think? Think we should ask GE maybe to help us out just a little bit with deficit reduction? Chevron, a major oil company, received a $19 million refund from the IRS after it made $10 billion in profits. Boeing, last year Boeing, which received a $30 billion contract from the Pentagon to build 179 airborne tankers, got a $124 million refund from the IRS. And on it goes. Valero Energy, Goldman Sachs. In 2008, Goldman Sachs paid only 1.1% of its income in taxes, even though it earned a profit of $2.3 billion. Gee, most Americans would be pretty happy to pay 1.1% of their income in taxes, but then again, they are not Goldman Sachs, Citigroup, ConocoPhillips, Carnival Cruise Lines, on and on and on. You got large, extremely profitable corporations who either pay nothing in taxes or get a rebate from the IRS. Maybe, just maybe, when we talk about deficit reduction, we might want to ask those people to help us out rather than go after the elderly, the sick, the children, and the poor. Mr. President, large corporations today are sitting on a record-breaking $2 trillion in cash. The problem is not that corporations are taxed too much. The problem is that consumers don't have enough money to buy their products, and the Republican agenda would make that far worse. Corporate tax revenue last year was down by 27% compared to 2000, even though corporate profits are up 60% over the last decade. Guys make more and more money. Their contribution to the Treasury goes down. Now, when we talk about how we can, in a fair way, in a responsible way, deal with our deficit and our national debt, man, here is one very clear example. Now, here you have in the Cayman Islands, Mr. President, a building, I think it's a 4-story building. And it looks like a normal-sized 4-story building. And yet it has 18,857 companies who call this building their home. Now, one of two things is going on. Either these guys are very, very crowded. 18,000 corporations in this one 4-story building. Maybe they're very crowded, and we should call in the zoning people in the Cayman Island to check that out, or maybe something else is going on. And, of course, what is going on is this is a total, absolute fraud. This is a building that doesn't house anybody. It's a phony address that 18,000-plus corporations use for the explicit purpose of not paying taxes to the United States of America. There are studies out there which suggest that large corporations and wealthy individuals are avoiding $100 billion in taxes every year by setting up these offshore tax shelters in the Cayman Islands, Bermuda, and the Bahamas. Maybe, before we tell young people that they can't go to college, or single moms that they can't get child care for their kids, or low-income seniors that we're going to cut back on their nutrition, maybe, just maybe, we might want to end this blatant outrage which costs us $100 billion every single year. Mr. President, in 2005, 1 out of 4 large corporations paid no income taxes at all, even though they collected $1.1 trillion in revenue. What about looking there for revenue? Our Republican friends say, oh, no, we can't do that. We got to force elderly people to pay more in Medicaid, throw kids off of Medicaid. Now, what is a very interesting point, Mr. President, and frankly, we are all politicians. You don't get elected to the Senate if you don't understand something about politics. What I don't understand, and certainly what President Obama needs to understand, is the overwhelming majority of the American people do not agree with the Republican approach which says give tax breaks to billionaires and go after the elderly, the sick, the children, and the poor. And that's just not Bernie Sanders talking. I'm not much into polls, to be honest with you, but I think it is important to just try to get a little bit of a reflection of where the American people are coming from. According to a recent Boston Globe poll, a couple of weeks ago, Boston Globe did a poll in the state of New Hampshire. They're mostly interested in the presidential campaign, how presidential candidates are doing in New Hampshire, but they asked some other questions. In New Hampshire, I know because they're a neighbor of mine, they're the big anti-tax state. They're the conservative state in New England, and here's what the folks in New Hampshire said in that recent poll. 73% support raising taxes on people making over $250,000 a year. 78% oppose cutting Medicare, 71% oppose cutting Medicaid, and 76% oppose cutting Social Security. The Republican approach is just the opposite. They want to cut Medicare, they want to cut Social Security, and they certainly do not want to ask the wealthiest people in this country to pay a nickel more in taxes. Well, that's one poll. Let's look at another poll. In fact, poll after poll has more or less mirrored what New Hampshire voters are saying. A recent NBC News, Wall Street Journal poll found the following. 81% of the American people believe it is totally acceptable, or mostly acceptable, that's how they frame these polls, to impose a surtax on millionaires to reduce the deficit. Let me repeat that. 81% of the American people in that Wall Street Journal NBC poll think it is totally acceptable or mostly acceptable to impose a surtax on millionaires to reduce the deficit. 81% of the American people think it is a good idea, and yet we can't get one Republican to ask the wealthy to pay a nickel more in taxes. Talk about being out of touch with what the American people want. 74% in that same poll of the American people believe it is totally acceptable or mostly acceptable to eliminate tax credits for the oil and gas industry, and on it goes. 76% believe it is totally unacceptable or mostly unacceptable to cut Medicare to significantly reduce the deficit. Now, here's an interesting poll that maybe some of my Republican friends want to pay attention to, and that is that while the leaders of the Tea Party here in Washington are fighting to dismantle Medicare and Medicaid It turns out that in another poll done by McClatchy, 70% of those people who identify themselves with the Tea Party oppose cutting Medicare and Medicaid to reduce the deficit. That is the Tea Party. Mr. President, here's the last poll I want to highlight, and there are many more out there. It was done by the Washington Post and ABC News. And here's what that poll says. It says 72% of Americans support raising taxes on incomes over $250,000 to reduce the national debt, including 91% of Democrats, 68% of independents, and 54% of Republicans. So here you have in Congress, surrounded by lobbyists and powerful special interests, a Congress heavily dominated by large campaign contributors of members of the Senate moving in exactly the opposite direction of where the American people want to go. The American people want shared sacrifice. The American people believe that when the wealthiest people in this country are doing phenomenally well and the gap between the rich and everybody else is growing wider, yes, the wealthiest people have got to contribute to deficit reduction. The American people believe that when you have corporations making record-breaking profits and not paying a nickel in taxes, yes, they have got to start paying taxes. And the American people overwhelmingly believe that it is bad for this country to go after Medicare and Medicaid and programs that working families desperately depend upon. Mr. President, instead of listening to millionaires and billionaires, it is time for our leaders here in Washington to start listening to the overwhelming majority of the American people who do want the wealthiest people in this country and the most profitable corporations to contribute to deficit reduction. It is time for shared sacrifice. The middle class, the elderly, the sick, the children, and the poor have already sacrificed enough. It is time for those people on top, the people who are doing extremely well, to also understand that they are Americans, they are part of our country, and they have got to contribute to deficit reduction. And the fact of the matter is, Mr. President, that moving towards deficit reduction in a way that is fair is not as complicated as some would have us believe. In fact, if you are not beholden to Wall Street, large corporations, and wealthy campaign contributors, and you are not frightened about the number of 30-second ads that may be thrown at you if you take these guys on, it is really quite easy. Now, I know that there are many people out there of good faith who have different ideas about how we can move forward toward a balanced budget, toward deficit reduction. And I'm not saying that I have all of the answers, but let me just give you a few examples as to how we can reduce the deficit by more than $4 trillion over the next decade, and that includes, of course, asking the wealthy and large corporations to begin paying their fair share of taxes and does not do undue harm to ordinary Americans. We can do it. We can do it. If you're concerned about deficit reduction, I am concerned about deficit reduction. But we can do it calling for shared sacrifice and in a way that does not attack programs that millions and millions of children, elderly, and working families are terribly dependent upon. Let me just give you a few ideas. And other people I know have other good ideas. First, if we simply repealed the Bush tax breaks for the top 2%, Mr. President, we could raise at least $700 billion over the next decade. That's it. Rich are getting richer. Bush gave them huge tax breaks. You repeal that, $700 billion. Now, I know that some of my Republican friends think, oh, my goodness, if you don't give tax breaks to the very wealthy, it will have a negative impact on jobs. And this is the trickle-down economic theory. You give tax breaks to the rich, large corporations, and we create all kinds of great jobs. Well, you know, that idea has been tested. That idea was tested. That was the idea of former President George W. Bush. But during his 8 years as president, when that idea was in effect, the private sector lost over 600,000 jobs, and we had one of the worst economic decades in terms of job creation ever seen in this country. We tried that theory. We did give tax breaks to the rich and large corporations, and we lost 600,000 jobs during that 10-year period. Meanwhile, when Bill Clinton raised taxes on the top 2%, you know what? The world didn't quite cave in. In fact, during Clinton's presidency, we created over 22 million jobs, and he left office with a huge budget surplus. But that's just one idea. Mr. President, you heard polls say we should impose a surtax on millionaires. Vast majority of the American people believe that. If you did a 5.4% surtax on millionaires and billionaires, that would raise $383 billion over 10 years. Mr. President, you want another idea? At a time when our manufacturing sector is collapsing, when 50,000 factories have shut down in the last 10 years, when millions of workers have lost good-paying jobs, the United States government continues to reward companies that move U.S. manufacturing jobs overseas through loopholes in the tax code known as deferral and foreign source income. That clearly, from a financial point of view in terms of revenue to our government as well as policy, which results in the loss of millions of good manufacturing jobs, is not something we should sustain. If we ended that absurdity, that policy alone, the Joint Tax Committee has estimated that we could raise more than $582 billion in revenue over the next 10 years. Now, what about that? $582 billion in revenue, and we stop the outsourcing of jobs so that maybe we can rebuild our manufacturing sector. Sounds to me like a pretty sensible idea. My Republican friends think it is a better idea to throw poor children off of Medicaid or force elderly people to pay far more they can afford for Medicare. But ending this absurd policy, which encourages companies to throw American workers out on the street, makes a lot more sense to me than what the Republicans are talking about. Fourth, Mr. President, if we ended tax breaks and subsidies for big oil and gas companies, we could reduce the deficit by more than $40 billion over the next 10 years. Fifth, if we prohibited abusive and illegal offshore tax shelters, what I just talked about a moment ago, we could bring in $1 trillion over 10 years. That says to the corporations and the wealthy, sorry, you're no longer going to be able to stash your wealth in the Cayman Islands and avoid paying taxes. Six, Mr. President, if we established a Wall Street speculation fee of less than 1% on the sale and purchase of credit default swaps, derivatives, stock options, and futures, we can reduce the deficit by more than $100 billion over the next decade, and also tell Wall Street that we're not going to tolerate their outrageous behavior, which led us into this recession in the first place. We are going to try to get a handle on their speculation. Well, number seven, Mr. President, if we tax capital gains and dividends the same way that we tax work, ordinary workers, we could raise more than $730 billion over the next decade. Why should somebody who clips dividend coupons pay a substantially lower tax rate than somebody who is out working on our streets or as a nurse or as a teacher? Warren Buffett has often said that he pays a lower effective tax rate than his secretary. And today, the effective tax rates of the wealthiest 400 Americans is just 18%, the lowest on record. And on, Mr. President, we have a number of ideas out there, not least of which taking a hard look at the military. There are debates as to how much we can cut, but certainly we should all be in agreement that it no longer makes sense to sustain weapon systems that were built in order to fight the Cold War against the Soviet Union. They are not our enemy right now. I can tell you that my office requested a GAO report that found that the Pentagon had $36.9 billion in spare parts that it does not need and which are collecting dust in government warehouses. We can do better than that. And frankly, Mr. President, in my view, and I think I speak for the majority of the people in my state of Vermont, and I suspect in this country, it is time to begin bringing the troops home from Iraq and Afghanistan at an accelerated rate. We have been in Afghanistan now for 10 years. It is time for the Afghan people and their military to take responsibility in terms of defeating the Taliban. We should be supportive of those efforts, but we should bring our troops home a lot sooner than the President has suggested, and when we do that, among other things, we also are going to save a substantial sum of money. Further, Mr. President, I will not deny for 1 second that there is waste and fraud and bureaucracy in almost every government program out there. I think we've got to take a hard look at them all. And I believe that in addition to the Pentagon, we can save hundreds of billions of dollars a year by eliminating unnecessary bureaucracy. Mr. President, the ideas that I've enumerated and some that I have not, but which will become part of the record, if we did all or some of these things, we could easily reduce the deficit by well over $4 trillion over the next decade, if not, in fact, much more. It would be done in a way that is fair, and it would not unnecessarily and needlessly ruin the lives of some of the most desperate and fragile and hurting people in our country today. Millions of people who are just struggling to make ends meet. Those people would be spared. Mr. President, the extreme right-wing agenda of more tax breaks for the wealthy paid by the dismantling of Medicare, Medicaid, education, nutrition, and the environment may be popular in the country clubs and cocktail parties of the wealthy and the powerful, but it is way out of touch with what the overwhelming majority of Americans want. Mr. President, as you know, late last week, Congressman Cantor, the Republican Majority Leader in the House, and Senator John Kyle, the Republican Minority Whip in the House, walked out of the budget negotiations being led by Vice President Biden. And the reason they walked out was pretty clear. They were not willing to close one single loophole in the tax code that allows the wealthy and large corporations to avoid paying taxes by stashing their money in the Cayman Islands, all the other loopholes that currently exist. Mr. President, my sincere hope is that President Obama will use this Republican walkout, their unwillingness to talk about the wealthy and large corporations contributing anything to a deficit reduction, that he will use this as an opportunity to rally the American people and make it clear that he will never support Republican demands to move toward a balanced budget solely on the backs of working families, the elderly, the children, the sick, and the poor. But I don't think that the President will do this unless the American people send him a message that enough is enough. The American people do not support the Republican agenda. The American people support the concept of shared sacrifice as we move toward deficit reduction. But the President has got to hear from the American people. He has got to hear that they will not accept decimating Medicare, Medicaid, Pell Grants, education, and the environment in order to give more tax breaks to the wealthy. The President has got to stand up for the millions of Americans who have seen their homes, their jobs, and their savings vanish instead of the millionaires who have never had it so good. Mr. President, it is my belief that if the American people make that demand of the President and tell the President not to yield on this issue, we can win this budget struggle. If people would like to, and I hope they would, we have a letter to the President, which I'm going to read in a moment, on my website. And also, as I mentioned earlier, they can contact the White House directly by going straight to the White House website and sending a message. And if hundreds of thousands of people do that, the President, I hope, will have the strength and the determination to say to the Republicans, sorry, we are not going to balance the budget on the weak and the vulnerable. Now, this is the letter that is on my website, sanders.senate.gov, which I hope people will sign. And this is what the letter says, which I think kind of encapsulates much of what I've been saying for the last hour. And this is what it says. It says, Dear Mr. President, This is a pivotal moment in the history of our country. Decisions are being made about the national budget that will impact the lives of virtually every American for decades to come. As we address the issue of deficit reduction, we must not ignore the painful economic reality of today, which is that the wealthiest people in our country and the largest corporations are doing phenomenally well, while the middle class is collapsing and poverty is increasing. In fact, the United States today has by far the most unequal distribution of wealth and income of any major country on earth. And the letter continues. Everyone understands that over the long term we have got to reduce the deficit, a deficit that was caused mainly by Wall Street greed, tax breaks for the rich, 2 wars, and a prescription drug program written by the drug and insurance companies. It is absolutely imperative, however, that as we go forward with deficit reduction, we completely reject the Republican approach that demands savage cuts in desperately needed programs for working families, the elderly, the sick, our children, and the poor, while not asking the wealthiest among us to contribute 1 penny. And the letter continues. Mr. President, please listen to the overwhelming majority of the American people who believe that deficit reduction must be about shared sacrifice. The wealthiest Americans and the most profitable corporations of this country must pay their fair share. At least 50%, let me repeat that, at least 50% of any deficit reduction package must come from revenue raised by ending tax breaks for the wealthy and eliminating tax loopholes that benefit large, profitable corporations and Wall Street financial institutions. A sensible deficit reduction package must also include significant cuts to unnecessary and wasteful Pentagon spending. Please, Mr. President, do not yield to outrageous Republican demands that would greatly increase suffering for the weakest and most vulnerable members of our society. Now is the time to stand with tens of millions of Americans who are struggling to survive economically, not with millionaires and billionaires who have never had it so good. Respectfully yours. So that is the letter that is on my website at sanders.senate.gov. I would hope, and I think we have many, many thousands of signatures on that letter already. I would hope that we get more. People would prefer to go to the White House website, do that. That will be important. But the main point here is that the President has got to know that we will not accept a deficit reduction package that just comes down heavily on working families. And I would say, and the reason I raise these issues today, Mr. President, is I am frankly very worried because we have gone through this negotiating process 2 times in the last 6 months, and that is why we need the American people to weigh in on this issue. In fact, we have seen this movie before. The Republicans, led by their extreme right wing, have been successful in getting their way because of their refusal to compromise and their willingness to hold the good credit and economic security of the American people hostage. As many people will remember, in December, the Republican leadership was prepared to hold the middle-class tax cuts and unemployment benefits hostage in order to extend the Bush tax breaks for the top 2%. And as we all know, the Republicans won. And as a result, over $200 billion was added to the deficit over the next 2 years. Not only did the Bush tax breaks for the wealthy get extended, they also got a reduction in the estate tax, which benefits the top 0.3%. Specifically, the December tax cut agreement extended the Bush income tax benefits, and it cost us very, very substantially. Mr. President, it is not just the Bush tax cuts that were extended. In March of this year, you'll all remember that our Republican friends said that unless we made very significant cuts, the Republicans were prepared to shut down the government, disrupt the economy, and deny paychecks to some 800,000 federal workers if they couldn't get their way. That's what they said. We're going to shut down the government unless you make these draconian cuts And one of the cuts that I was very disturbed about, among many, were $600 million to build new community health centers, which will keep people alive and in the long run end up saving money by keeping people healthy. There were other draconian cuts there as well. They also cut the Pell Grants, making it harder for students to go to college. Point is, they acted as bullies, and they said, if we don't get our way, we are prepared to shut down the government. And now we're back at it again. This is Part 3 of the Act. Part 1 was whether or not the middle class would get its tax breaks and unemployment benefits would be extended. Republicans won. Part 2 is whether or not the government would be shut down. Republicans mostly won. They didn't get everything they wanted. They got almost everything they wanted. And here we are today, in the biggest act of all, Act 3, and the question is whether the Republicans will, in fact, not raise the debt ceiling. And if they do that, it is quite possible that not only our country but the entire world might be plunged into a major financial crisis. And that is what they're threatening. If we don't get everything we want, we're prepared not to pay our government's debt for the first time in the history of our country, prepared to see interest rates go up in a very fragile global economy, prepared to see more and more instability. Mr. President, in many ways, the Republicans here in Washington are acting like schoolyard bullies. And as we know, bullying is a very serious problem in our schools. Every educator worth his or her salt would tell you that when you're dealing with a bully, you must not give in to their tactics or tolerate their temper tantrums or allow them to hurt innocent people. You have to deal with them sternly and consistently. You cannot allow them to win by dictating the rules of the game and trampling over everyone else if they don't get their way. Mr. President, we have a serious deficit problem that must be solved. No one would deny it. But it must be solved in a way that is fair, in a way that calls for shared sacrifice. So, Mr. President, let me conclude by suggesting to you that the American people are concerned about the deficit, but they are also concerned about the economy, and they are also concerned that so many of our people of all ages and all parts of this country are hanging on economically by their fingernails. And the American people understand that it is just not fair at all, to come down on people who are already hurting and leave unscathed the wealthiest people in this country and large, profitable corporations. So what I would say today to the President of the United States, Mr. President, stand tall, do not yield to Republican blackmail, stand with the vast majority of the American people who believe that deficit reduction requires shared sacrifice, that everybody makes a sacrifice, not just working families, not just the elderly, not just the sick, not just the poor. So with that, Mr. President, I would yield the floor, and I believe note the absence of a quorum.
Clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Akaka.
Consent to call the call be terminated.
Without objection.
I now ask unanimous consent the Senate proceed to H.R. 2279.
Clerk will report.
H.R. 2279, an act to amend the Internal Revenue Code of 1986 to extend the funding and expenditure authority of the Airport and Airway Trust Fund and so forth, and for other purposes.
Without objection, the Senate will proceed to the measure.
I ask unanimous consent the bill be read 3 times passed. Motion reconsider be laid on the table. There be no intervening action or debate. Any statements relating to this bill be placed in the record at the appropriate place as if read.
Without objection.
I now ask consent that we proceed to calendar number 57, S. Conres 15.
Clerk will report.
Calendar number 57, S. Conres 15. Concurrent resolution supporting the goals and ideals of World Malaria Day and so forth.
Without objection, the Senate will proceed to the measure.
I now consent that a amendment to the concurrent resolution be agreed to. The concurrent resolution as amended be agreed to. Preamble be agreed to. The motion to reconsider be laid on the table. There be no intervening action or debate. And any statements relating to this matter be placed in the record at the appropriate place as if read.
Without objection.
I now ask unanimous consent that we proceed to S-Res 217.
Clerk will report.
Senate Resolution 217, calling for a peaceful and multilateral resolution to maritime territorial disputes in southeastern Asia.
We'll proceed to the measure.
I further ask the resolution be agreed to, the preamble be agreed to, the motion to reconsider be laid on the table, there be no intervening action or debate. Any statements relating to this matter be placed in the record at the appropriate place as if given.
Without objection.
I'm told there are two bills to desk due for second reading.
Clerk will read the titles of the bills for the second time.
S-1276, a bill to repeal the authority to provide certain loans to the International Monetary Fund and so forth and for other purposes. H.R. 2021, an act to amend the Clean Air Act regarding air pollution from outer continental shelf activities.
I would object to any further proceedings with respect to these bills, these two bills.
The objection is heard. The bills will be placed on the calendar under the provisions of Rule 14.
H.R. 1249 has been received in the House and is at the desk.
Clerk will read the title of the bill for the first time.
H.R. 1249, an act to amend Title 35, United States Code to provide for patent reform.
I would ask for its first reading. Has that been done? That's what we just completed, okay? I would then ask for second reading, but object to my own request.
The objection is heard. The bill will be read for the second time on the next legislative day.
Mr. President, I would ask unanimous consent that three of Senator Bingman's interns, Paco Veneri, Haley Murphy, and Elizabeth Reese, be extended the privilege of the floor during tomorrow's proceedings of the Senate.
Without objection.
I now ask unanimous consent that when the Senate places business today adjourn until tomorrow morning, Tuesday, June 28th at 10 a.m. Following the prayer and the pledge, journal proceedings to be approved to date. The morning hour to be named expired, and the time for the two leaders to be reserved for the use later in the day. Following any leader remarks, the Senate proceed to executive session under the previous order, and that following the disposition of the Cole, Sites, and Monaco nominations, the Senate recess until 2:15 p.m. for the weekly caucus meetings. Finally, that 2:15, the Senate resume consideration of the Presidential Appointment Efficiency and Streamlining Act.
Without objection.
The first vote will be tomorrow at noon on confirmation of James Cole to be Deputy Attorney General, working on an agreement to complete action on the Presidential Appointment Efficiency and Streamlining Act. So additional roll call votes are expected tomorrow. Mr. President, if there's no further business to come before the Senate, I ask that it adjourn under the previous order.
The Senate stands adjourned until 10 a.m. tomorrow.
And today the Senate took up no legislative business. Members spoke